Every morning, as Portland awoke, a silent conversation began in a quiet window. An elderly artist facing her final chapter hung a new painting, a vibrant whisper of a life lived and loved. Unseen, a delivery driver bore witness, piecing together a profound love story, frame by poignant frame. But what happens when the silent whispers turn to desperate cries? The ritual began with the morning light, a pale, watery gray that was so characteristic of Portland, seeping through the blinds and painting stripes across the worn wooden floor. For Miriam, 66, the light was a summons. She pushed herself up from the bed, her bones protesting with a familiar, deep ache. The cancer, a relentless and unwelcome tenant in her body, made every movement a negotiation. A tremor, a souvenir from her latest round of chemotherapy, danced in her hands as she shuffled, one hand tracing the wall for support, towards a tall, flat file cabinet in the corner of her living room. Inside, nestled in protective sleeves, was a lifetime. Her lifetime, Eleanor's lifetime. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and dried pigment. Her trembling fingers slid past dozens of canvases until they found the one she was looking for. Today, it was a sun-drenched memory from 1978. Two young women, their faces alight with a laughter so pure it seemed to radiate heat, sharing a strawberry ice cream cone on the Santa Monica Pier. She could almost feel the phantom warmth of the California sun on her skin, taste the cloying sweetness of the ice cream. Hear Eleanor's gasp as a cheeky seagull swooped low. With a pair of worn wooden clothespins, she clipped the watercolor to a thin wire she'd strung across the inside of her large window. It was a sacred, silent liturgy. More than a habit, it was an act of defiance. A declaration that the vibrant colors of her past would not be bleached out by the sterile white of a hospital room. This was her conversation with a ghost, a refusal to let the final chapter be written by illness and invisibility. Across the street, parked in his battered blue delivery van, Logan switched off the rumbling engine and the world fell quiet. At 29, his own routine was as fixed as Miriam's. He always arrived 15 minutes early for his shift, parking in the same spot that gave him a clear view of her window. He'd sip his lukewarm coffee and wait. He wasn't an art critic. He was a man who spent 10 hours a day moving boxes, his life a blur of cardboard and tracking numbers. But for these few minutes, he was an audience of one. He had been watching for months. He saw the story spooling out, one frame a day. He'd seen the shy blush of a first date in a snowy park, the shared weight of a private joke in the crinkle of an eye, the comfortable silence of decades spent together in a single, painted gesture. He didn't know her name. He didn't know about the cancer. But through the glass, he felt he knew Eleanor. And every morning, as the city slowly woke around them, he bore silent witness to a love story that was still being told. The rain began in the afternoon, a steady, insistent drumming that mirrored the new, alarming rhythm in Miriam's chest. A fit of coughing seized her, violent and ragged, leaving her doubled over the kitchen sink, gasping for air. It stole her breath and left behind a coppery taste of fear. The world swam in a dizzying haze. When she finally caught her breath, her hands shaking, she dialed her oncologist's office. The conversation was a blur of medical jargon, disease progression, palliative options, but the meaning was clear. The doctor's voice, filtered through the phone, was professionally compassionate but heavy with the finality of a closing door. Time, once an expansive ocean, had shrunk to a small, rapidly evaporating puddle. The weight of it was crushing. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the profound, suffocating loneliness of the journey toward it. Eleanor had been her anchor in every storm. Now the storm was inside her and she was utterly adrift. That day, the painting she chose was different. The vibrant hues were gone, replaced by a somber palette of charcoal, indigo, and gray. It depicted two hands, wrinkled and liver-spotted, clasped tightly together against the backdrop of a turbulent sea under a bruised sky. It was a scene from Eleanor's last week in the hospital, a moment of desperate, silent communication when words had failed them both. Hanging it in the window felt like hoisting a flag of surrender. Across the street, Logan saw the new painting and the coffee went cold in his hand. He sat there long after his break was over, the rain streaking down his windshield, blurring the image. This piece was different. It was raw, visceral. It hit him with the force of a physical blow, dredging up a memory he kept locked away. He saw his grandmother's hands, twisted by arthritis, gripping his own as the fog of Alzheimer's stole her away piece by piece. He had been a student then, full of talk about brushstrokes and composition. But in his grandmother's last years, he had learned about a different kind of art, the art of holding on, of bearing witness, of loving someone through their slow, painful fade. He had dropped out of his art history program to care for her. He recognized that same language of love and loss in the painting in the window. He saw the sophisticated layering of washes, the confident lines that conveyed so much with such economy. This wasn't a hobby. This was the work of a lifetime, a talent as vast and deep as the love it chronicled. And he was suddenly struck by a chilling thought. He might be the only person in the world who was truly seeing it. The image of those two hands, a testament of love against a stormy sea, haunted Logan for the rest of his shift. It clung to him as he scanned packages, as he navigated the rain-slicked streets, as he offered polite, meaningless smiles to customers. With every delivery, the contrast grew sharper. The transient, disposable nature of the cardboard boxes he handled versus the permanence and profound weight of the art in that window. He felt a growing sense of unease, a gnawing conviction that he was complicit in a great injustice. To allow such a powerful story, such undeniable talent, to simply fade away with its creator felt like a form of vandalism, like watching a library burn down one book at a time. He was not a man of action. Logan was a watcher, an observer by nature. His life was a series of quiet routines designed to minimize friction, to avoid notice. He was the guy who took the extra shift, who never complained, who faded into the background. Speaking up, inserting himself into someone else's life, was contrary to his very nature. He played out the scenario in his head, knocking on her door, a stranger stammering out compliments. The thought made his stomach clench with a familiar, paralyzing anxiety. What would he even say? "Hi, I'm the guy who stalks your window art from his van." The words sounded foolish, intrusive. But then, as he drove past her building on his way home, the rain finally letting up, he saw a flicker of movement. The curtains, usually drawn back to frame the daily painting, were pulled almost shut. In the narrow gap, he saw her silhouette for a brief moment, frail, slightly stooped, moving with an unnerving slowness before disappearing into the gloom of the room. The sight broke through his paralysis. It was a stark, visual confirmation of what the painting had already told him. This wasn't just about art history anymore. It was about a human being, clearly in pain, whose life's work was crying out from her window. The desperation in that gray painting was a call for help, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't heard it. An idea, clumsy and audacious, began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, born of a quiet desperation of his own. He remembered a place downtown, a sanctuary of color and words he'd stumbled into once while trying to escape a sudden downpour. A bookstore, a specific bookstore under the Rainbow Bridge. It was more than a shop, it was a community hub, a safe harbor. A plan, as fragile and hopeful as a watercolor wash, started to take shape. He was going to do something. He had to. The risk of making a fool of himself suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the certainty of regret if he did nothing. The bell above the door of Under the Rainbow Bridge chimed softly, announcing Logan's hesitant arrival. The bookstore was a warm, cluttered haven, smelling of paper, coffee, and a hint of lavender. Books were stacked everywhere, overflowing from shelves and creating colorful, teetering towers on tables. A woman with a cascade of silver-streaked braids and kind, intelligent eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. This was the hard part. Logan's heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering nervously over the gallery. The photos were terrible, shot from across the street, through his van's dirty windshield, blurry and distorted by the angle. "This is going to sound strange," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He showed her the first picture, the one of the two young women with the ice cream. "There's a woman, an artist, I think. She lives across from where I park for work. Every day she hangs a different painting in her window. I've been watching for months." He stumbled through his explanation, showing her the blurry snapshots. A dance in an autumn park, two figures huddled under an umbrella, the stark, heartbreaking image of the clasped hands. The owner, whose name tag read Amara, leaned in, her initial polite curiosity shifting to focused interest. She took the phone from his trembling hand, expertly zooming in on the details he'd captured. "She's very good," Amara said, her voice soft with surprise. That was the opening Logan needed. The anxiety receded, replaced by a surge of purpose. The forgotten language of his art history classes came flooding back. "She's more than good," he said, his voice gaining confidence. "Look at the use of wet on wet here, the way the colors bleed to create that sense of nostalgia. It's reminiscent of early Impressionism, but the emotional core, the narrative, it's pure modern expressionism. It's a whole life, a whole love story being told on a single pane of glass." He finally looked Amara in the eye. "And I think she's sick. The paintings have been getting sadder. I'm afraid she's running out of time, and no one is seeing this." Amara looked from the photos on the phone to Logan's earnest, worried face. She saw not a strange man with a weird fixation, but a kindred spirit who recognized the urgency of a story that needed to be saved. She understood immediately. This wasn't just about art. It was about legacy, about bearing witness, about the quiet, uncelebrated lives that hold so much beauty. "You're right," she said, a decisive spark in her eyes. She gestured to the small, empty gallery space at the back of the store. "This space is free next month. Let's give her a show." The week that followed was a blur of clandestine activity. Amara, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, mobilized her network. She called a friend who owned a framing shop and, after hearing the story, offered to do the work at cost. She designed a simple, elegant flyer on her computer, featuring a cropped, enhanced image of the ice cream painting. At the top, in a graceful script, were the words, "Love letters from a window asterisk." Logan's role was crucial. He became a gentle spy, his morning ritual now imbued with a new, thrilling purpose. He carefully, discreetly, took more photos, trying to capture the best possible images for Amara to work from, feeling a pang of guilt each time he lifted his phone. The hardest part was choosing a day to approach her. "It has to be a surprise, but a gentle one," Amara had insisted. "We can't overwhelm her." Finally, with a stack of freshly printed invitations in a tote bag, they stood before her apartment door. The peeling green paint and tarnished brass number 2 billion seemed impossibly intimidating. Logan's courage, so robust in the bookstore, had evaporated, leaving a cold dread in its place. He could hear the faint sound of a television inside. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. "It's okay," Amara said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "We're just delivering an invitation. The worst she can say is no." He took a deep breath and knocked. The sound was too loud in the quiet hallway. They waited. Footsteps shuffled slowly toward the door, followed by the scraping sound of a chain being unlatched. The door opened a few inches, and a pair of wary, tired eyes peered out. Miriam looked even smaller and more fragile up close than she did through the window. Her face was pale, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion. "Yes?" she asked, her voice thin, suspicious. Logan's carefully rehearsed speech vanished. His mouth went dry. He simply held out the invitation. "My name is Logan," he stammered, his voice cracking. "And this is Amara. I'm the driver of the blue van. I park across the street every morning." Miriam's eyes flickered from his face to the invitation he was holding. She saw the image of her and a leaner, young and radiant. Her expression shifted from guarded suspicion to utter, breathtaking disbelief. Her gaze darted to the window at the end of her own hallway, then back to the two strangers on her doorstep. How did you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been watching," Logan said, his own voice thick with emotion. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the street. "Every day. I see them. They're too beautiful to only be seen from my truck." The carefully constructed wall Miriam had built around her heart for years, the one that had withstood illness and grief and loneliness, crumbled in an instant. This stranger, this silent, anonymous man from the van, hadn't just seen her paintings. He had understood them. He had seen asterisk her asterisk. A tear escaped and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. It was a tear of sorrow, of gratitude, of a lifetime of quiet love finally being acknowledged. The night of the exhibition, under the Rainbow Bridge, was transformed. The bookstore buzzed with a gentle, reverent energy, a stark contrast to its usual bustling daytime persona. Miriam's paintings, now professionally framed and lit, lined the walls of the gallery space. Freed from the confines of the window pane they breathed. The colors seemed richer, the emotions more potent. A lifetime of love was laid bare, from the tentative, sun-drenched beginnings to the quiet, shared intimacies of old age, and finally, to the profound sorrow of the storm-tossed hands. Miriam sat in a comfortable armchair Amara had placed in a quiet corner, a soft quilt over her lap. Logan had picked her up, helping her navigate the steps with a gentleness that felt as familiar as if he'd been doing it for years. She was overwhelmed, a spectator at the public unveiling of her own soul. She watched as people, strangers of all ages, moved from one painting to the next. They didn't just glance. They lingered. They pointed out details to each other in hushed tones. She saw a young lesbian couple, hands intertwined, smiling with recognition before the ice cream painting. She saw a silver-haired gentleman in a tweed jacket stand for a long time before the portrait of her, and a leaner reading in companionable silence, his shoulders shaking slightly. She felt a presence beside her, and turned to see a young man with kind eyes and a nervous smile crouching down to her level. He couldn't have been much older than Logan. "Miss Miriam?" he asked softly. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. I wanted to say thank you," he continued, his voice earnest and full of emotion. "My partner and we talk about growing old together all the time, but we never see it, not really, not like this." He gestured around the room at the decades of devotion hanging on the walls. "Thank you for showing us that love never gets old." The words landed like a balm on a wound she hadn't known was still open. Love never gets old. It was the thesis of her entire life, a silent creed she shared with a leaner, now spoken aloud by a stranger. It was the ultimate validation, a gift more precious than she could have ever imagined. Her eyes, clouded with tears, searched the small crowd and found Logan standing near the back, watching her. He was crying, too. She lifted a trembling hand, and across the crowded room, silently mouthed the two words that felt both impossibly small and infinitely large. "Thank you." The exhibition was more than a success. It was a phenomenon. A reporter from the local Alt Weekly attended and wrote a deeply moving piece that was shared thousands of times online. Suddenly, Miriam's quiet life was filled with gentle noise. Visitors from the bookstore, neighbors who had only ever known her as the quiet woman in 2 billion, and young art students began to visit, not with pity, but with reverence. They brought flowers and soup, but more importantly, they brought their time, sitting with her as she, in a voice frail but clear, finally told the stories behind the paintings. Logan became a permanent fixture in her life. He stopped parking across the street and started parking in her building's lot. He'd bring her groceries after his shift and stay for tea, the two of them falling into a comfortable friendship that defied their differences in age and experience. He was no longer just a silent observer. He was family. Miriam passed away 3 weeks later, in the early morning light she had always loved. She died in her own bed peacefully, her last days filled not with loneliness, but with the warmth of a community that had found her just in time. She was not a tragic figure. She was a celebrated artist, a beloved storyteller. In her will, she left every single painting to Amara, with the instruction that they be sold to establish a small fund at Under the Rainbow Bridge, a grant to support and exhibit the work of elderly LGBTQ+ artists. Her love story would now help other stories be told. Months later, Logan was back in his van, his shift about to start. He instinctively glanced up at Miriam's old window. For a while it had been dark and empty, a painful void. But today something was there. A new painting, vibrant and abstract, full of bold, hopeful strokes of color, was clipped to the very same wire. A new tenant, a young artist who had heard the story, had moved in. The window was alive again. A quiet legacy of beauty, a testament to the power of being seen, was continuing. A silent, colorful conversation between a window and the world.